I have kept a logbook for 41 years. Cattle counts, weather, the price of feed, the day my wife stopped being able to climb the porch steps. I write because I do not trust myself to remember things the way they actually happened. Memory softens what it touches, and I have learned to distrust soft things. But there is one entry I have never been able to finish. It sits there, third week of February, in handwriting that gets worse the further down the page it goes, because by the end of that night my fingers were not entirely mine anymore. I wrote 4 words and then I stopped, because I did not yet know how the story ended, and I was afraid that if I guessed, the guessing would make it true. The 4 words were, "He is still up there." I have crossed them out a dozen times over the years. I have written them again. I am an old man now, and I have decided that before whatever is coming for me arrives, I should put the whole thing down, not the soft version, not the version I tell at the feed store when somebody asks why I won't ride that high country in winter anymore. The real one. Because there was a man who lived inside a crack in a mountain, and there was a storm that should have ended him. And what happened between those 2 facts changed something in me that I have never been able to set back the way it was. Stay with me. I am going to tell it the way it came, slow at the start, the way the cold comes, so quiet you don't notice it's already in your bones. The first thing I knew about him was the smoke. It was the tail end of a hard January, the kind that makes a rancher mean. I'd lost 4 head to the cold already, and I was riding the upper fence line of the Dorrance allotment, land I leased, land I had bled into for most of my adult life, looking for a 5th that had wandered off and probably already died somewhere with its legs folded under it. I remember being angry at the cow, which is a stupid thing to be, but grief and money will do that to a man. They'll make him angry at a dead animal for the crime of dying. The mountain up there isn't really a mountain. It's a long spine of red and gray rock that the old maps just call the reef, and most folks who have worked that country their whole lives have never set foot on it because there's no reason to. No grass, no water you can count on. Just stone stacked on stone, split through in places by cracks deep enough to swallow a horse, with the wind always moving through them, so the whole formation seems to be breathing if you sit still long enough to listen. I'd been told as a boy not to go up there. I'd never asked why. Some things you just absorb. So when I saw smoke, thin, blue-gray, rising in a straight line in the still cold air from somewhere about 2/3 up the reef's western face, my first thought wasn't who. It was no. The kind of no you say when the world breaks a rule you'd grown to depend on. Nobody lived up there. Nobody could. I sat my horse for a long while and watched it. The smoke was steady, tended. It wasn't a brush fire and it wasn't lightning. There'd been no lightning in weeks. Somebody was keeping a fire alive in a place where, by every law I understood, no one had any business being. I should have ridden on. I want you to understand that I am not by nature a curious man. Curiosity is expensive out here. It gets cattle lost and men killed. But my wife, Ruth, had a saying she'd picked up from her mother, and it had wormed its way into me over the years. You don't get to choose what God puts in front of you, only whether you look at it. I turned my horse toward the reef. It took the better part of 2 hours to find a way up, and another hour of leading the horse on foot over scree that slid out from under us both, before I understood that I was being allowed to approach. There were marks. I see that now, small cairns, a worn place on the rock where a hand had steadied itself 1,000 times, a switchback path so subtle that you'd only follow it if you already knew it was there or if someone wanted you to. The mountain wasn't letting me in. He was. He'd seen me long before I saw him, and he'd decided. I'm telling it in order, the way it happened, but I'll be honest that I didn't understand the half of it until later. At the time, I just thought I'd gotten lucky with the footing. The crack, I keep calling it a crack, and it was, but that word does it a disservice. Imagine the mountain split by a giant's axe and the blow stopped halfway. The opening was maybe 4 feet wide at the bottom, and it narrowed as it went up until 40 feet overhead. The 2 walls nearly kissed, leaving only a ragged ribbon of sky. It ran back into the rock for what I'd later learn was almost 100 feet, and it bent, so that standing at the mouth you couldn't see the end of it, just darkness and the orange flicker of firelight bouncing off stone, and the smell. God, the smell. I have never forgotten it. Wood smoke, yes, but underneath it, dried herbs, tanned hide, old grease, something animal and warm and lived in. The smell of a place a person had decided to stay. You can put the rifle away. I hadn't drawn it, but my hand had drifted to it, the way a hand does, and his voice, coming out of that darkness, calm, unhurried, in English with the particular careful weight of a man for whom it was not the first language but had become a comfortable one, made me lift my palm off the stock like it had burned me. He stepped into the firelight, an old man, older than me, and I was no spring colt even then. Apache, I knew that much from how he held himself and from the country we were in, though I'd learn his band and his name and a great deal more before the winter was through. His face was all weather, deep cut, the skin gone to the color and texture of the rock around him, like the mountain had been slowly claiming him and he'd been letting it. He wore a heavy coat of layered hide and wool, mismatched, mended 100 times. His eyes were very dark and very still. "You've been watching the smoke for a long time," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 days, I admitted. I hadn't meant to admit it. There was something about him that made lying feel like a waste of both our time. He nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he'd suspected about me, that I was the kind of man who watches a thing for 3 days before he does something about it. I have wondered since whether that was a compliment or a diagnosis. "Sit," he said. "You climbed a long way to find out something. Sitting is how you find things out." His name was Nate, not the famous one from the history books. He was quick to tell me that, with the tired patience of a man who'd had to clarify it his whole life, but named for him, by a grandmother who'd believed names were a kind of inheritance you could choose to honor or squander. He was, by his own reckoning, somewhere past 80. He'd lost track of the exact figure, the way you lose track of the exact number of fence posts on a long line. At some point, the counting stops mattering, and only the walking does. He had lived in that crack for 11 years. I didn't believe him at first. I want to be honest about that too. I sat by his fire and drank the bitter tea he handed me without asking whether I wanted it, and a part of me was cataloging the impossibility. 11 winters in a hole in a rock. No man could. And then I looked, really looked, at what he'd built, and the disbelief drained out of me like water through sand. The crack was a home, not a hovel, not a hermit's squalid burrow, a home, arranged with the deliberate intelligence of a man who had nothing but time and had spent it well. He'd built up the floor with flat stones and packed earth so it was level and dry. He channeled the seep water that ran down one wall into a series of carved basins, so it pooled clean and he could dip from it without crawling. He'd hung hides to break the narrow passage into rooms, a sleeping place, a place for the fire that sat beneath a natural flue in the rock where the smoke drew up and out, which is why it had risen so straight and clean. He had drying racks. He had a store of piñon nuts and dried meat and roots I couldn't name, sorted into vessels he'd shaped from clay he must have hauled up on his back from God knew where. He had a place where he kept things that had no purpose but memory. A child's worn moccasin, a tin photograph too faded to make out, a string of blue beads. He had made a life inside a wound in the earth. "Why?" I asked him finally. The fire had burned low and the strip of sky overhead had gone from blue to bruised to black, and I knew I should have started down hours ago, and I knew I wasn't going to. "Why here?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer, and I'd learned already not to push him. He gave what he gave when he was ready, and pressing only made him go further inside himself, like a turtle, like the mountain. "Because no one would follow me here," he said at last. And then, after a while, he turned one hand over, a small gesture that took in the fire, the stone, the basins of clean water, the 11 years, Because it was mine. The first thing that was ever only mine. I didn't understand that then. I do now. But understanding it took me the rest of the winter and a price I am still paying. I went back. That's the part I can't fully explain, even to myself. A reasonable man, having satisfied his curiosity, would have ridden home and told the story at the feed store and let it become one of those tales that gets a little taller every year. But I went back the next week, and the week after, and by the time the worst of the cold set in, I was riding up the reef every few days, leaving my own troubles at the bottom of the mountain like a coat I could hang on a peg. I brought things. Coffee, which he pretended not to care about and then drank like a man remembering a language he'd thought he'd forgotten. A good knife. Tobacco. He took them without much thanks, but I came to understand that the lack of thanks was the thanks. He was treating me like someone who didn't need to be flattered, which is a thing old men do for each other when they've decided to be honest. And he gave me things back, not objects, stories. Slowly, the way you'd feed a fire you wanted to last, a stick at a time. He told me he'd had a wife, and that she'd died, and that he didn't speak her name anymore because speaking it used it up. He told me he'd had children, and that one was dead and two were alive somewhere down in the world of fences and papers and motor cars, in lives he'd been told he was not welcome in. Not by them, he was careful to say, but by the shape of the world they'd had to fit themselves into to survive it. He told me he'd spent decades being moved, being counted, being told where his feet were allowed to land, until one day he'd simply walked into the country no one wanted and kept walking until the world lost track of him. "They think I am a story now," he said once, with something that was almost a smile. "The old man on the reef. The children of the ranchers dare each other to climb up. They never make it past the scree. I let them turn back. It is good for them to have a story they are afraid of. Every person should have one mountain they did not climb." I laughed at that. He didn't, but his eyes did, and I'd come to learn that was as far as his laughing went. What I didn't know, what neither of us knew, sitting warm in his strange, perfect home while January bled into February, was that the mountain that other men were afraid of was about to become afraid of nothing, and that the storm already gathering somewhere out past the curve of the world had both our names in it. The blizzard came on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because of the logbook, and because Ruth had her appointment in town that morning, the one where the doctor used the gentle voice that means the news is not gentle at all, and I had driven her down and back through air that was already going strange, a yellow-gray light in the sky and a smell on the wind like cold iron. "You're not going up there," Ruth said, not a question. She was looking out the kitchen window at the reef, just visible as a dark spine against the sick-colored sky. "Not today." "No," I said. "I went up there." I have asked myself 10,000 times what I thought I was doing. The honest answer is that I wasn't thinking at all. I was knowing, in the wordless way you know a thing in your gut before your head catches up. I knew that an 80-some-year-old man alone in a crack in a mountain was going to need wood, and water he could reach, and another body that gave a damn whether he lived or died, and I knew the storm coming was not an ordinary storm. The cattle knew it too. They'd bunched against the lee of the barn in a way I'd seen maybe twice in my life, both times before weather that killed. So I loaded my saddlebags with everything I could carry that might matter. A side of bacon, coffee, my heaviest blanket, a bottle of whiskey for the cold and for the fear. And I rode up the reef into the teeth of it while my wife watched from the window and did not wave, because waving would have meant agreeing, and she would not agree. I beat the storm to him by maybe an hour. He was not surprised to see me. He was never surprised to see me. But I saw something in his face I hadn't seen before, and it took me a moment to name it because it sat so strangely on him. Worry. Not for himself. He'd weathered 11 winters in that place, and he knew its moods the way I knew Ruth's. The worry was for me. "You should not have come," he said. "You will not be going down for a while." "I know," I said. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something he had never done. He reached out and put his hand on my shoulder, just for a second, just the weight of it, and then he turned away and started moving wood closer to the fire, and we did not speak of it again. But I have carried the weight of that hand on my shoulder for the rest of my life. It was the moment I stopped being a visitor. The storm hit like the sky had been holding it back with both hands and finally let go. I had been in bad weather. I want you to understand that I was not a soft man and I knew cold the way a person knows an old enemy. But I had never been inside a storm the way we were inside that one. The wind came down the reef and found that crack and used it like a flute, and the sound, I have no words that do it justice. It was not howling. Howling is a thing with an end to it. This was continuous, a single endless note that rose and fell but never stopped, a sound that got into your skull and lived there, that made it hard to think, hard to remember that the world had ever been quiet. The temperature fell so far so fast that the water in the basin skinned over with ice. Snow drove into the mouth of the crack sideways, impossibly, defying the shelter the rock should have given. And the dark came early and total, the strip of sky overhead simply gone, erased, so that the only light in the whole world was the fire, and the only warm thing was the fire, and the only sane thing was the fire, and we fed it and fed it and fed it. The first night we managed. The second day the wind didn't let up, and we used more wood than we should have, and I saw Nate begin to ration his glances at the woodpile, a flick of the eyes, the calculation of a man who has done arithmetic with his own survival many times before. The second night the cold came for us in earnest. I had thought I understood cold. I understood nothing. This cold was a presence, a thing with intent. It pressed in from the stone on every side, from the floor, from the air. The fire held it back in a sphere maybe 6 feet across, and beyond that sphere was death, patient, waiting. We pulled in close, both of us, 2 old men and a fire in a crack in a mountain while the world ended outside, and Nate talked to keep us awake, because sleep was the cold's ally and we both knew it. He told me her name, his wife's. He spoke it into the fire like an offering, and I understood that he was spending something he could not get back, and I understood why. Because he thought we might die, and he did not want to die with her name still locked up inside him unsaid, used up by silence instead of love. I will not write it here. It was not mine to keep, only to hear. But I heard it and I held it, and I have never told it to a living soul. On the third day the boy came. I have to slow down here, because this is the part that the soft version leaves out, and it's the part that matters most. There was a sound that wasn't the wind. We almost missed it. The wind ate most sounds, but Nate heard it first, his head coming up like a deer's, and then I heard it. A voice, thin and broken, somewhere down the reef's western face. A human voice calling out, the words torn away but the desperation in them unmistakable. Someone was on the mountain, in the storm, dying. What I learned later in pieces was this. A rancher's boy, 16 from the spread north of mine, had gone out the first morning of the storm to bring in horses and gotten turned around in the whiteout. And instead of finding his way home, he'd done the thing you're never supposed to do. He'd kept moving, kept climbing, some animal instinct telling him up, toward the dark shape of the reef that he could sometimes see through the snow, the only landmark in a white nothing. He'd been on that mountain for 2 days. By every reasonable measure, he should already have been dead. And here is the decision. Here is the morally heavy thing I promised you, except it wasn't mine. It was Nature's, and watching him make it taught me something about the human soul that I have never been able to unlearn. To go after the boy meant leaving the fire. It meant going out into that storm, into that cold that wanted us on a mountain face slick with ice and buried in snow, 2 old men, one of them past 80. The odds of finding the boy were poor. The odds of dying in the attempt were excellent. And here is the part I am ashamed of. I hesitated. I hesitated. I thought of Ruth at the window. I thought of the doctor's gentle voice that morning that felt like a year ago. I thought, I cannot leave her alone, not now, not for a stranger's child who is probably already dead. And the thought was so reasonable, so adult, so responsible that I almost mistook it for goodness. Nate was already pulling on his outer hide. He didn't hesitate. There was no visible struggle in him at all, and at the time I read that as some kind of saintliness, some superior courage. I was wrong about that, and he corrected me later, and the correction is the truest thing anyone has ever told me. "You think I am not afraid," he said. This was after, when it was over, when we both knew how close it had been. "I'm very afraid. I have always been afraid, but fear is not the thing that decides. A long time ago I let other men decide where my feet would go. I told myself, never again, so now I decide. And I will not decide to sit by a fire while a child dies in the cold I know how to walk in. That is all. It is not courage. It is just the one thing I get to choose." He looked at me then, and there was no judgment in it, which somehow made it worse. "You can stay with the fire," he said. "Someone should. It is not wrong to stay with the fire." And then he went out into the storm. I sat there for the length of 3 heartbeats. 3. I have counted them so many times. Then I went after him, because the alternative was to be a man who let an old Apache walk to his death alone, while I kept my hands warm. And I found that I could not be that man and still live inside my own skin. What the mountain kept, I will not pretend I remember it clearly. Cold does things to memory. It comes back to me in pieces, out of order, lit by the small flashlight I'd had the sense to bring, and the strange gray almost light that storms have at the edge of total dark. I remember the rope. Nate had a length of it, old and stiff, and we tied ourselves together, him in front because he knew the mountain and I behind because I was stronger. And we went down the western face on our hands and feet, into the place no sane man goes. I remember the wind trying to peel me off the rock. I remember Nate stopping, again and again, head cocked, listening, reading the mountain, reading the storm, reading something I couldn't read, until at last he changed our direction with a certainty I had no grounds for and no choice but to trust. And I remember the boy. He was in a hollow under a shelf of rock, curled so small, gone so still that my heart simply stopped. Because I was sure we'd come all that way to find a body. His lips were the color of the storm. His eyes were half open and they didn't track the light. Nate got to him first and put his old weathered hand against the boy's throat and held it there for a terrible long moment, and then he looked back at me and he said one word. "Alive." Getting him up was worse than getting down. The boy couldn't help us. He was past helping, dead weight, his body shutting itself down room by room the way a house gets dark when someone goes through turning off the lights. We dragged him. We fell. The rope saved us twice. Nate, 80-some years old, pulled at that boy with a strength that had no right to exist in a body that old, and I understood that it wasn't coming from his muscles. It was coming from the place where he decided, 11 years ago and again that night, that no one would ever again tell his feet where they could and could not go. I do not know how long it took. Hours. The fire had burned down to almost nothing when we finally dragged the boy back through the mouth of the crack, and Nate fell on it, feeding it, breathing it back to life with the last of the dry wood while I worked on the boy the way I'd worked on chilled calves 100 times, getting him out of the frozen clothes, getting him into the blanket, getting my own body against his to give him what warmth I had left. He lived. I'll tell you that now so you don't have to carry the not knowing the way I had to. The boy lived. By morning he was shivering, which is a good sign. It means the body has decided to fight again. And by the time the storm finally broke on the 4th day he could speak, could swallow the broth Nate made, could weep, which he did, a great deal, the way you do when your body finally understands it isn't going to die after all. But there is always a but. The soft version stops at the boy living. The true version goes on because the cold does not give without taking, and it had been promised something that night, and the cold collects. Nate had given the boy his outer hide. I hadn't seen him do it. It had happened out there in the dark and the chaos, and I only understood it after when we were back inside and I saw that he'd come down the mountain and back up it again in half the clothing he needed, because he'd wrapped the dying boy in the rest. He'd given his warmth away, all of it, to a stranger's child, a rancher's son, one of the kind of people whose grandfathers had spent their lives moving nature's people from one patch of nothing to a worse one. He never said a word about it. When I realized and tried to give him my blanket, he waved it off and made me put it back on the boy. "He is younger," Nate said. "It matters more in the young." By the fourth morning, when the wind finally died and the strip of sky overhead came back, pale and blue and innocent as if it had never tried to kill us, Nate was sitting by the fire very still. Too still. And I knew. I'd seen enough living things go to know the particular quality of a stillness that isn't rest. He was warm enough by then. The fire was strong. The danger had passed for the boy, for me. But something in Nate had spent itself out on that mountain and was not going to come back. He'd done arithmetic with his own survival one last time, and he'd known the answer when he gave the boy his hide. He'd known. That was the thing I couldn't bear after, that he had known and had chosen anyway calmly, the way he chose everything in the end. The one thing that was his to choose. "Take the boy down when the snow firms," he said. His voice was very quiet. "It will firm by midday. The path will hold." "Nature." "I am not going down." He said it the way he'd said you can put the rifle away the first day, calm, sir, a man stating a fact about a world he understood better than I ever would. "I told you, the first thing that was ever only mine." He looked around the crack at the basins and the drying racks and the child's moccasin and the string of blue beads, 11 years of a life built inside a wound in the earth. A man should get to die in the one place that was his. Most don't. I am luckier than most. I argued. Of course I argued. I am ashamed now of how I argued, because I was arguing for me, not for him. I didn't want to be the man who left him, didn't want to carry that down the mountain along with the boy. He let me argue until I ran out of words, and then he said the last thing he ever said to me, and I am going to write it down even though I have never spoken it aloud, because it is the reason for everything that came after, the reason I never rode that high country in winter again, the reason this entry has sat unfinished for so many years. He said, "You looked. When God put me in front of you, you looked. Most men ride on. You did not." He closed his eyes. "Now look at one more thing and then take the boy home to his mother. Look at me so that someone remembers I was here and that I was free and that at the end I chose. That is all anyone gets, to be looked at, to be remembered, to choose." The snow firmed by midday, just as he said. I took the boy down. He was weak, but he could walk with my arm around him, and we went slowly. And twice I looked back up at the reef and the thin straight line of smoke still rising from the fire I'd built up as high as I could before I left, and the second time the smoke was already thinner. I delivered the boy to his mother, who fell on him in the snow of her own yard and made sounds I have only heard a few times in my life, the sounds a person makes when something they'd already begun to grieve is given back. She tried to thank me. I couldn't take it. I told her there'd been an old man on the mountain, that the old man had saved her son, that I'd only helped. She didn't understand. How could she? She made me a hero in the telling, and I have let the lie stand all these years because the truth was too heavy to hand to a grateful mother, and because the truth was not mine to give away. It was Nature's. He'd asked only to be remembered, and I have remembered him every single day, and that has had to be enough, even though it has never felt like enough. I went back up in the spring, when the snow let go of the high country. The fire was long cold. He was where he'd been by the hearth, gone back to the mountain the way he'd always seemed to be doing, slowly, the stone claiming what it had lent. I buried him there, in the floor he'd built up flat and dry with his own hands, in the first and only thing that was ever only his. I put the string of blue beads in with him. I kept the child's moccasin. I have it still. It sits on my desk as I write this, and I do not entirely know why, except that it belonged to a child he loved, in a life that was taken from him, and someone should keep it who knows that it matters. Ruth lived 2 more years, good ones mostly. The gentle-voiced doctor had been right about the news but wrong about the time, and we stole more of it than we were promised. I never told her Nature's wife's name either. Some things you carry alone. That's not a tragedy. That's just what it is to be trusted. The boy grew up. He runs the spread north of mine now, has children of his own, and he does not know, I never told him, that the reason he is alive to have them is that an old Apache he never met gave him the hide off his own back and walked back up a mountain into a cold he knew would finish him. The boy thinks an old rancher saved him. He waves at me when we pass on the road. I wave back. I have made my peace with carrying it. I am old now, older than I ever thought I'd get, and a good deal older than I deserve, given who paid for some of my mornings. The thing that's coming for me is taking its time, but it's coming, the way the storm came, slow and quiet and then all at once. And I find that before it gets here I needed to finish this entry. To cross out those 4 words one last time, he is still up there, and write the true ones underneath. Because he is not still up there, not the way I meant it that night, hopping against the cold. He came down a different way. He came down into me, and into the boy's whole line of children that wouldn't exist without him, and into every single time in 40 years that I stood at a fork between the warm, safe thing and the right hard thing, and heard an old voice say fear is not the thing that decides. He asked to be looked at, to be remembered, to have chosen. I have looked, I remember, and I am writing it down at last so that when I am gone, he won't be, so that someone reading this will know that there was a man who built a refuge inside a giant rock crack, who lived free in the one country no one could take from him, and who, when a stranger's child was dying in the storm, did the only thing he ever truly got to do,